Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We're more than honored today to be sitting down with Bob Burnett. Bob is the chairman and CEO at Barefoot Mining. He's the former CTO and EVP at Gateway Inc. He is found on Twitter at boomer_BTC. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Justin. Nice to see you.
You mine Bitcoin, and that is actually quite a contentious topic increasingly, and I think it's only going to get increasingly contentious based on what I'm seeing now. Something that I think this space is not discussing really at all or enough is this push really to, I guess, outlaw or ban proof of work. I'm not sure if you're seeing the same trends. I'm seeing that there's lots of literature out there that says that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment. I believe there was a lawmaker in New York who actually said that while she was looking to perhaps ban proof of work in New York, I believe was a law approximately.
Yeah.
She was not looking to ban Bitcoin because Bitcoin could always just use a different consensus method after all, right? So that is astonishing. I think it is very telling about the power of Bitcoin, perhaps also telling about the lack of power of perhaps other consensus methods. Have you been watching this push in Europe, in the US, New York in particular? I believe Washington actually I'm here in North Idaho. Washington State is 15 minutes to my west.
Right.
I believe they're taxing Bitcoin miners now at up to 30%.
Yeah.
Wow. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, yeah, it is a highly controversial area. I believe the detractors come from two perspectives. I think the first is a group of people that really don't understand it or grasp Bitcoin. They latch on to sensationalized headlines about power consumption and then extrapolate environmental impact from that power consumption. That's one group. And the second group, I think, is using a similar mantra, but they're really threatened by what Bitcoin is and its potential impact on the world's financial systems. And they're using that as an attack vector. And I would say that for those of the people that are listening that are less familiar with mining and consensus protocols and things like that, essentially what mining does is I would say it does two things. The first is it validates and processes transactions. So there has to be a method in any transaction by which that transaction gets authenticated. We're used to financial systems that require what we would call a trusted third party. That might be Visa or MasterCard or your bank approving a check. And one of the major innovations of Bitcoin was doing that in what we call a trustless manner, meaning that you don't need that third party involved and you can validate that transaction with 100% certainty and finality without having that third party there. Now, clearly that's one of the main functions of banks and financial institutions is to do that. So Bitcoin in of itself presents a threat because it can do that. It uses a method called proof of work in which to do that. And it's a compute intensive process by which that happens. The second thing, though, that at least in Bitcoin, the consensus mechanism in mining do is it's the method by which money gets introduced into the system, so into circulation. So it essentially is acting as the central bank. So the proof of work system, as I said, it's compute intensive and energy intensive. And that's by design. That in and of itself provides that level of security. And it also provides this decentralized network that makes it at least thus far, been proven to be immutable from attack. Bitcoin has never been hacked. The protocol works phenomenally and consistently. Even when things like the China ban happened, which was approximately a year ago, the network can run seamlessly. Now, there are others who, and I'm not in the camp, so I want to preface my comments here. I'm not in this camp, who believe there are other methods of providing at least the consensus piece and other methods by which you can manage the money supply. The most popular being a method called proof of stake. And what a lot of the supporters of proof of stake will say, and a lot of the people who are detractors of Bitcoin will say, is, well, proof of work is fine. It's not energy intensive. In simple terms, instead of using computing power and energy to validate the transaction, it is using staking, the concept of staking, which is essentially saying somebody in the network is putting a bunch of their own money at risk. They will validate the transaction, and if they are found to be approving transactions they shouldn't, then they lose their money. They lose the money that they've staked. I'm oversimplifying, but just try to keep it simple. The problem, as I see it, and I think those of us in the Bitcoin camp see it, is that it's not a foolproof system. So it's highly centralized, first of all, which means people or groups of people can still control the protocol. You'll actually even see things like in the blockchain, which is basically the recording of all the transactions in the network. Bitcoin just chunks along, and there's never been a reversal of transactions or a change in the blockchain. In Ethereum, even in the last 6 months, for instance, there was a block reversal. In other words, it's kind of like saying, oops, there was a mistake. We're going to reverse the blockchain and change a transaction and then rerun the other transactions. That's the way the existing kind of fiat system works. I know maybe for your audience, it's kind of what the LME did with the nickel trading, if you remember that from, what was that, maybe like 4 months ago or something on that order, where they just said, hey, things are out of control. We're going to stop trading. We're going to reverse and basically back out a bunch of transactions and reset. That's a very fiat thing to do. The beauty of Bitcoin is that it just keeps working. And so getting back to your fundamental question with that as a basis, I believe, and most Bitcoiners believe, that what Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and proof of work bring is an immutable financial system with true transaction finality. It's something that can't be manipulated, and that regardless of how much power it takes, we'll start from that position, it's worth it to have a form of money and a monetary system that can't be corrupted and is transparent to everybody, is in and of itself worth it. Then you can back into some other things relative to power consumption if you want to go down that path and say, well, the power consumption of Bitcoin is, there are different estimates, but it's between 1/10 and 1/50th of the existing banking system. It's half of the gold mining industry. It's, so it's less than the Christmas tree lighting. We have statistics across the industry that show, for those that are very concerned about it, as an industry, it has the highest percentage of renewable energy usage of any industry in the world. It's about 60% of all the Bitcoin mining. And it incents the development of new forms of energy. So maybe with that, I'll kind of stop for a minute and that you comment or ask further about that, Justin.
I'm looking at a CoinDesk article right now. It's a CoinDesk article from April of 2022, and it's Sweden, EU discuss Bitcoin proof of work ban. It's a report. I'm just going to read that. It's pretty short.
Sure.
Swedish financial regulators and the European Commission have discussed the possibility of banning the proof of work method that underpins Bitcoin because of its impact on the environment, according to documents published by Netzpolitik.org, a German website. The revelation comes after lawmakers at the European Parliament came close to passing restrictions on the energy-hungry Bitcoin mining method, which some characterized as a Bitcoin ban. Documents apparently released under the EU's Freedom of Information laws show that at a meeting in November, Swedish financial and environmental regulators and the European Commission's digital policy arm discussed banning trading in crypto assets such as Bitcoin that use the proof of work technique. An unnamed attendee said that Bitcoin should be encouraged to move toward a more environmentally friendly alternative, such as proof of stake, as rivals such as Ethereum have done, and didn't, quote, see the need to protect the Bitcoin community. Parts of the document have been redacted to protect individual privacy or due to, quote, ongoing decision-making process. The ongoing decision-making process, suggesting that policy is still being developed on the topic. Swedish officials have previously made it clear that they want to ban proof of work for environmental reasons. A separate document suggested discussions were still ongoing in February and included German Environment Ministry officials. Now, as a miner, Bob, when somebody says that Bitcoin can just switch consensus methods, what do you think?
Anybody that wants to fork Bitcoin can do so. A term that maybe not familiar for everybody, but the Bitcoin code is what's called open source, and the blockchain is available. So if next Tuesday, Justin, you and I get together and we say we want to fork Bitcoin and we want to replace the consensus mechanism, we can do that, and we can take all the transactions in the blockchain to the date. We can move them over to our new system. We can go into the code, we can replace the consensus mechanism, and we can run it. The question is, it's highly unlikely we're going to convince all the other people in the Bitcoin network. And by that, I mean the miners and what are called the nodes. And we probably come back and talk about nodes in a little bit, but we have to convince all those people to join with us. And if we did, then that would effectively be a hard fork of Bitcoin, what would be called a hard fork of Bitcoin, and off we would go. Now, people that have tried to hard fork for different reasons, it's happened frequently. There's Bitcoin Cash, there's Bitcoin SV, there's Bitcoin Gold, there's all kinds of Bitcoin Z, there's all kinds of them. People have tried it. Nobody's been able to get any movement. And I think the reason they can't get movement is that the miners and the nodes are, on the whole, and by the whole, I mean like huge majority, like 90, 95, 99%, believe in the architecture of Bitcoin, and they're not going to change. So for me as a miner, and I've spent 35 years in technology, I've spent 20 years studying Austrian economics. I have a technical degree as well as an economics degree. You know, I believe it is sound. It is the only new monetary system that really has a chance of fixing the inherent problems in the existing one. I'll take a sidelight there because I think it's important. I think Bitcoin in itself is often misunderstood. You'll hear its detractors often say it's just a speculative asset. It's backed by nothing. You'll hear a lot of those things. We're talking about environmental stuff right now. But what it really is a new monetary network. And you know, it's set up at the core to act as a means by which not only we can store wealth, but that we can move wealth, and we can do it in a way that is very inexpensive. It's immediate, it's immutable. And those are massive attributes that I'm sure a lot of the people in in your audience, especially people like in the precious metal world, they often come from very much the same mindset of, hey, let's solve this problem. So going back to the article that you read, there's essentially no hope of that. And I also want to point out there's a huge thing going on when you hear about whether it's the state of New York or Finland or Sweden. When they say they are trying to ban proof of work protocols, what they're trying to do essentially is dictate what software you can run on your computer. That's at the core what it is. This is just software. And so you've got governing bodies, I think, way overstepping their bounds, saying, hey, we're now trying to dictate two things. We're trying to dictate, one, what software you can run on your computer. Could easily be extended. Excel is okay and PowerPoint's not, as an example. This browser is okay, but that one is not. The second thing they're trying to do is dictate what you can plug into the wall or change your rate based on what you plug into the wall. These are huge personal liberty issues in my mind that, by extension, and technology may make this very possible, 10 years from now, if you plug in a hair dryer, you're going to get charged one electricity rate. But if you plug in your electric razor, you get a different one, because the one is considered a luxury and one is considered a necessity. I think that the world has to be very careful about what it's pushing for. And I think the reason Bitcoin has become a poster child for a lot of these things, in my opinion, is not the climate threat. I believe it poses essentially no climate threat, by the way. We can come back to that. But what it is attacking, we, when I say we, collectively, the Bitcoin community and the ecosystem, we present a threat to the monetary system, the establishment monetary system. And so I believe that, if you take control of the monetary system away from governments and the existing financial establishment, you're playing with the core essence of their power. I actually sent a tweet recently, and I'm not quite sure my exact words, but essentially it was, the power of controlling the ballot box pales in comparison to the power that comes with controlling the monetary system. And so when you look at politicians and the power base of the world, if you threaten their ability to print money, control the money supply, control financial transactions, you're talking about a major change in the power base of the world. So I think that's what's at the core of what we're seeing.
And is that perhaps why there is this push against proof of work in particular?
Yeah, because proof of stake. So you say, why don't they move to a different consensus mechanism? Well, if you move to a different consensus mechanism, you now move to a consensus mechanism that has forms of centralized control. The blockchain itself doesn't become immutable, as I mentioned before. It allows you to go back and reverse transactions. In the Bitcoin world, if I were to send you one Bitcoin right now, Justin, that transaction would achieve what we call final transaction finality, or transaction finality, within 10 minutes. And as long as you control the keys to that Bitcoin, there's nobody in the world that can make you give that Bitcoin up, and nobody can take it from you. Now, they could put a gun to your head and say, give us the key, Justin. You then have a choice of whether or not to give it up or die. But it's your choice. They can't go into the system and reverse it. And that there's a lot of power that goes with that. They can't reallocate money. Bitcoin has a hard cap of 21 million. and a rate at which we will achieve the 21 million. That can't be changed. So the government can't say, hey, I want to fund a social program. I want to fund a war. I need more money. We're going to just print some more and dilute everybody and debase everybody. That can't happen in the Bitcoin world. So you'll hear a lot of times Bitcoiners talk about Bitcoin being a mechanism toward freedom and truth and honesty, these kind of deeper philosophical things. But that's where they're coming from, is that if we got the world to a Bitcoin standard, not unlike to a certain degree when we had gold standards without governments fractionally reserving it, there's a lot of similarity to that. It forced honesty in politicians, right? Wars were shorter, for instance, because the only way to fund a war was to tax people or take on debt. People didn't put up with it for very long, right? That the wars were short because people's ability to fund it and willingness to fund it would evaporate pretty quickly. When you can just debase people and pay for the same things, and you kind of hide it, and the ramifications of the debasement are typically not felt instantly, they're felt down the road. Well, that changes things. So I will also say, I believe that jurisdictions, you mentioned the state of Washington, which has imposed, I think it's 29% actually, but 29% tariff on the use of electricity for mining. They're going to have an enforcement issue, by the way, but let's even assume they can do it. What will happen is miners like myself, we've already crossed Washington off as a state that we're gonna be in. And in the United States, there are plenty of states that embrace it. So, we'll be in Texas and Oklahoma and South Dakota and Florida and places that do, and states like New York, Washington, Oregon, California, that have shown themselves to be less friendly, let's say, to it. They'll not get the capital investment. They won't get the mining centers in their places. And if the entire United States, by the way, tried to ban it, I think we would end up in a massive states' rights battle. It seems like we're in a lot of those these days, right? I think it would become a massive states' rights battle. Even if that happened, there are plenty of countries that also have open arms to mining. El Salvador as an example, and I'm talking to people in Norway. I'm talking to people in Kenya. I have interest kind of all over the world in mining. So I think there'll always be somebody that wants it.
It has been quite interesting watching the states' rights battles that have been waged since 2020 in the US. You've mentioned climate change, and obviously there's lots of concerns about proof of work mining, albeit erroneously, and the environment. You tweeted recently, you retweeted a SCOTUS decision. The SCOTUS tweeted, quote, "The Supreme Court sharply curtails the authority of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. In a 6-3 ruling, the court sides with conservative states and conservative states." I think it's so funny. They're just states. The court sides with some certain states and fossil fuel companies in adopting a narrow reading of the Clean Air Act. Now, there's been obviously, so I'm thinking on the environment front, what have we seen lately? All sorts of kind of insane sort of environmental pushes. Oh yes, of course, in the Netherlands, right? I guess they're banning nitrogen now, right. And so there's big protests. It's not in the news. So unless you are seeking out your information, you're not seeing this. But under the guise of greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen's being cut, I think, towards zero, if not zero. Farmers basically are protesting because they're like, then what are we going to eat? Now, luckily here in the US, as we've seen this kind of dynamic play out, the checks and balances, we see this court decision. You tweeted, "This is not a ruling about climate change. It is a ruling about the rights of the states and ultimately individuals to make decisions about what energy they use and how they use it." I know you've touched on that a little bit already, but do you have any further comments on that?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it comes down to the very construction of our country. And, it's interesting that, we start talking about something like Bitcoin and then you end up kind of here on these topics. And, it's kind of part of my journey as I've gone down into what we call the Bitcoin rabbit hole. So we'll start at the kind of the state level. So, we've seen different states take different actions. California, for instance, has made a very strong statement. They're shutting down nuclear, they're shutting down coal. And the citizens of that state are, I guess, I'll use the word suffering from the consequences of that. Very high electrical rates, fears of things like brownouts. And I would say this though, as a state, if their decision is to do that and live with the consequences of less reliable sources of energy, so be it. I mean, I think that that's well within their power. But on the other side, you take a state like West Virginia, which, by the way, has a very different population. It has a different culture. It has a different socioeconomic strata. Just like if we were talking about Kenya or we were talking about the Central African Republic, they have a very different structure as well. They have and so the right to energy and be able to use energy, I think is very fundamental. And if you as whatever your group is, if it's a state, if it's a community, if it's a village, whatever, if you don't have access to reliable and affordable energy, there's probably maybe other than water, access to clean water, there's probably nothing else that has more of an impact on the quality of life that you're going to have in that community. And so when you have a group like the EPA, which was the ruling that I was talking about, basically the EPA was coming in and trying to, and was through the Clean Air Act, trying to force West Virginia to a set of standards that didn't make sense for their way of living. And there's a lot of politics and gamesmanship because they set it up often, they being the people promoting it. When you call something, for instance, the Clean Air Act, you're essentially saying that anybody against it is against clean air. And obviously that's not true. The people in West Virginia and these other places, they don't want to live in a dirty place with a bunch of pollution. But they have to balance whatever level of pollution and emissions they have with the benefit that they get from that energy. And so I think that's what's going on at the state level. It'll go on at the nation state level as well. So as you said, if countries like the United States, let's say at the federal level, try to enforce something too strongly, you're going to lose industry, you're going to lose business, you're going to lose people to other countries that are more amiable and flexible. So, I mean, everything is has to be within reasonable bounds, of course. We can't have somebody putting up a nuclear power plant and flowing radioactive materials into, let's say, the Mississippi River. Clearly, that's that's something where some level of authority and reasonableness has to be put in place. But there's a slippery slope that I touched on before, which is, to me, I'm sitting here in my office. I've made several decisions: monitors, computers, microphones, TVs, etc. I've made decisions about using the electricity in the manner that I see fit. You've made the same decisions in your house. You may set your air conditioning unit at 74 because that's where you're comfortable. And we may set it at 71 in our house because that's where we're comfortable. We'll pay the appropriate, to be a little cooler than you, will pay the appropriate amount of money for that extra access to that energy. I think that's in my right. We may decide we don't use the dishwasher though, and wash all our dishes by hand, and you use the dishwasher. Again, those are decisions for you and your family to make in your lifestyle. I'm very afraid of groups trying to push across that line. And what I think people have to always be aware of is when these kind of legislative things happen, they're often Trojan horses. So obviously you have a financially literate group. I'll give you an example. The Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 has a reporting mechanism that if you deposit or spend more than $10,000 in cash in any one transaction, there's a reporting that has to go into that. Now, at the time that act went into place in 1970, the average household income in America was less than $10,000. So the people in that time would have said, hey, that doesn't sound so bad. I would never spend more than $10,000. It won't affect me because, I'm never going to do that. And the only people doing that must be people doing unscrupulous things. Well, fast forward over 5 decades of debasement, and guess what how many changes they've made to that limit? 0. So now $10,000 is not that much. I mean, it's still a lot of money, but you might go buy a used car. There are a bazillion mechanisms. Fast forward another decade or two, especially of continuing debasement and inflation, and it may be, hey, you're taking your family to dinner at Denny's, and the bill's $11,000, and in addition to paying your bill, you get to fill out the form for the government saying, what was the source of the money, and how long have you had it, and who did you get it from, and blah blah blah. So those are the concerns. And when you look at places like China that have now combined monetary systems with things like social credit scores, you get very, very scary consequences. So, and again, that goes back to Bitcoin to a certain degree. Why am I passionate about Bitcoin? Because I want to have at least a parallel monetary network, if not a replacement monetary network, that allows me to have a set of things where I can't be confiscated and I can't be stopped because somebody else has decided on some set of criteria that says I'm a bad person or I'm not worthy of having access to my own money.
We're talking basically about ESG, environmental sustainability goals. Peter Schiff called them a hate factory, I believe, at Bitcoin 2022. I have not watched that whole speech, and it is on top of my list to view. Now, I want to wrap up here on the push to ban proof of work as I see it, and your thoughts on how that might play out. Then I want to kind of take a step back and ask you about, what point in world history do you see us as being in? Now, in the US, Senator Warren has been one of the most outspoken Bitcoin detractors. The United States is home to more than 1/3 of the global computing power dedicated to the Bitcoin mining. The United States has turned its attention to domestic miners and their impacts on the environment and local economies. Senator Elizabeth Warren noted concern in June 2021 over the environmental toll of proof of work mining. On December 2nd, 2021, Warren sent a letter to New York-based Bitcoin miner Greenridge Generation in which she requested information on the company's environmental footprint. The letter noted, quote, given the extraordinarily high energy usage and carbon emissions associated with Bitcoin mining operations at Greenridge and other plants raise concerns about their impacts on the global environment, on local ecosystems, and on consumer electricity costs. a committee hearing on, quote, cleaning up cryptocurrency, the energy impacts of blockchains. And I will also clarify that when we see this type of legislation, we're talking about Bitcoin here, a committee hearing on cleaning up Bitcoin, the energy impacts of Bitcoin, I believe is a better way of viewing this. The U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce's Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations held a January 2022 hearing to focus on crypto mining, Bitcoin mining. The hearing focused on proof of work. January 27, 2022, 8 Democrat members of Congress, led by Senator Elizabeth Warren, sent letters to 6 crypto mining companies raising concerns over their extraordinarily high energy uses. Warren evoked the same concerns later in that letter, and then also requested information from Riot Blockchain, Marathon Digital Holdings, Stronghold Digital Mining, BitDeer, Bitfury Group, Bit Digital, in order to assist Congress's investigation. Their questions revolved around their mining operations, energy consumption, possible impacts on climate and local environments, and the impact of electricity costs for American consumers. Where do you see, first of all, do you agree that perhaps the Bitcoin industry and community is not focusing enough on this proof of work? I guess push to really, I think, eliminate. I think that's where this is heading personally. 29% tax in Washington state. And so then are we not focusing and discussing it enough? Are we not recognizing the implications of this focus on proof of work as opposed to proof of stake and what that says about the power of this technology versus proof of stake? And third, do you think they will ultimately be successful in banning proof of work?
Let's handle that in reverse. And I may need help remembering the first two, but so will they be successful? The answer is no. And I would say as long as in the United States, I will say that there is zero chance it will be banned globally. There will always be a place that wants it. We already have 2 countries, Central African Republic and El Salvador, where Bitcoin is legal tender. So there's absolutely 2 places in the world that we could easily go. And I've visited El Salvador twice in the last year. I met with the government and the Department of Energy there. There's zero chance they're going to ban it. In the United States, I think as long as states' rights remain strong, which is why I've hit on that a couple times before, I don't think there will be any contest that there will always be a place where it happens. Can you repeat maybe the other 2 pieces for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, are we not focusing on the action of regulators enough?
Yeah. The answer is no, we are not focused on it. One of Bitcoin's biggest problems, I think, is that there is not a CEO of Bitcoin. They're guys like me. We're a loose community. We don't necessarily, even as a community, all agree on everything, right? So that's the pro and the con of being decentralized the way that we are. There is a group called the Satoshi Action Fund that I have endorsed and I'm participating in, which is trying to educate legislators, really focused on state and federal legislators to try to educate them. But it's a long process, right? And a certain percentage of them, we have to try to fight through the media headlines, some of which you've already kind of written today, that's been their exposure to Bitcoin so far. So they're coming in, as opposed to coming in as a clean slate, they're coming in as skeptics. So that creates, I think, Bitcoin has been categorized as this power hog that's going to ruin the environment, number one. And then number two, those of us in it have been categorized often as shysters and runners of Ponzi schemes. So, when you're going to come in with when somebody has that attitude and you have to try to undo that just to get them to a level set, that's a hard task. So that is a big problem. So I think you've nailed that, Justin. I testified in May. I was in Michigan this is I guess the optimistic piece. I was called before the Michigan Senate in May as an expert witness and testified before the Michigan Senate to a panel of both Democrats and Republicans. And I will say I was at least encouraged by that it was they have a bill, it's called Bill 888 in Michigan, which is, it's really just a bill to create a task force, but it's done with the aspect that they are concerned that they're going to fall behind, and that both in Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, and as one of the 10 biggest states in the country, a massive energy producer, they're afraid they're losing out to states like Texas in this battle for capital and battle to be part of the Bitcoin network. So that was encouraging to me, because I think, not that this should, the reality is it becomes a very political issue. And I think to a certain degree, most of the states that sit as strong proponents and with open arms to the Bitcoin community are largely Republican states, right? They're very red. And the blue states, like, you know, the New Yorks and the Washingtons and the Californias have often been the very Democratic ones. Michigan, and there's some of the countries that I guess are purple ones, right? Like in their case, they have a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, and a Republican controlled Senate. And they've come together in a bipartisan way. So that gives me some level of optimism that if you take away the extremes, which I'll give them the benefit of that. I think people that are environmentally concerned and are environmental activism oriented people, that is their mission. Okay, so right or wrong, I mean, that's what they do. They certainly have the right to do that. Bitcoin does not present the threat that they think it presents. In fact, it could well be part of a solution. And if, you know, you mentioned ESG before too. ESG is interesting because it's environmental, social, and governance. But it seems like nobody really talks about the S and the G. So even if Bitcoin has environmental concerns, it gets no credit for the S and the G that it provides, which it provides. There are approximately 2 billion unbanked people in the world. And Bitcoin gives them a mechanism to participate in a global financial network instantly. And they don't even have to make an initial deposit. You can get a wallet for nothing and get started, and you can go dig a hole for somebody and get paid a little bit of Bitcoin for it. And now you're part of the network, and there's no minimum balance fees. And in a lot of places in the world, you don't have to provide ID and all those sort of things. Now, those same sort of things will often get presented as well. Let's move off of the environmental piece. Now you're aiding and abetting money laundering and things like that. That's kind of the other side that we often get attacked on. But you had another question.
We touched on it. It was essentially, you know, why, and we touched on it, proof of work and not POS. Like, I mean, isn't this a important theme that we've seen develop in the blockchain industry? We've had this debate, like Bitcoin's inefficient. We need a more efficient systems. Proof of stake is better. No, proof of stake is centralized. And now here we have essentially like world governments across the board coming after POW and not POS. And from my view, that makes me, you know, maybe I'm just antagonistic generally, kind of more confident in Bitcoin as a technology, especially compared to POS.
Right. Well, you know, groups like the World Economic Foundation, Forum, excuse me, Forum, they've been huge detractors of Bitcoin and a big piece of the mantra about Bitcoin. They had at one point put out a projection because they don't really understand it, but I don't think they really want to understand it. That's the second part of the equation. They put out a report I think it was at the end of 2017, that if not controlled by the year 2020, Bitcoin would consume all the world's power. And we control like, I don't know, 0.05 or 0.5% or something like that of the world's power is Bitcoin. The world's electricity, and the percentage of the world's power is infinitesimal. It doesn't really work that way. Could Bitcoin still consume more of the world's power? Yes, but there's a lack of understanding about the way technology works. And for instance, there's something called Moore's law. So it's been the foundation of the computing world forever. It's the reason that I started designing laptop computers in 1986. That's my background, and we developed a computer in 1986. I believe it sold for about $3,500, and had a tenth of the power of the phone that you carry today. Well, why can you buy a computer 1,000 times more powerful than that one today for $600 if you march down to Best Buy? It's because of Moore's law. Well, Moore's law applies to Bitcoin mining too. So while we are consuming more energy, it's leveled off quite a bit. So it's not on the same exponential curve. Yet the computing power dedicated to it is orders of magnitude more, because we're able to use these technological advances. I think we're going to face this FUD for a long time. There's something I call the Unholy Trinity, which is it's three organizations, three kind of clusters of people. One is central banks and governments. That's one. The second one are groups and organizations that are environmental activism oriented, and the third are I'll be nice, and it's the altcoin community, primarily based around proof of stake. And they're three very unaffiliated groups. They each view Bitcoin as a threat for their own reasons. Well, what's kind of happened over the last year, you'll actually see, you mentioned Elizabeth Warren earlier, who's I'll be frank, is not one of my favorite people. And they start echoing each other's words. So, I think where you've seen central banks and governments and environmental activism groups start chattering about proof of stake, it's because the proof of stake people are essentially now saying, well, we can fix this problem and we can do it for a lot less power consumption. What they fail to articulate is they are not actually solving the same problem. Proof of stake may have a role in the world. It may do certain things, but as a base layer of money, it won't work. If we changed Bitcoin, it really wouldn't be Bitcoin anymore, but let's just play along with it. If we changed Bitcoin to be proof of stake, it would eventually be as manipulatable and corruptible as the existing monetary system. So why do the central banks and the governments and the WEF and places like that, why are they strong endorsements of POS? Because it allows them to look like, oh, we're modern, we're open to change, we're open to these new systems, but they know it's just a backdoor to the same thing they've always had.
I'm looking at a Newsweek article from 2017. Bitcoin mining on track to consume all of the world's energy by 2020. Now, you mentioned these I asked about where we are in world history. Where do you think we are in world history? I studied history in college and I did lots of extracurriculars. Then I didn't really focus on too much school in high school. I didn't do too bad either, but I didn't do anything close to great.
Yeah.
I was like, just whatever I had to do to get by was good enough for me. In college, I'm like, I'm going to take this real serious. So I started studying history and I started doing extracurriculars and started examining kind of, I guess, particularly the last 75 years and the consolidation of power we've seen over that time, the consolidation of power we've seen over the last 12 years in the form of bailouts. Everybody's very familiar with that, are all quite concerning. In my opinion, the the $1 trillion bailouts in 2020, the bailouts in 2008, in 2008, 2009.
Yep.
These are the things that make rebellions in and of themselves, but they're really just a kind of one data point amongst many a data point regarding why people have increasing distrust of their representatives, of corporations, etc. And coup d'etat comes to mind often when I think of where we are today with some of these big organizations you mentioned, and the amount of power consolidation we've seen, the amount of usurpation of power we've seen, and which has been pushed back upon by the states, as we've seen in many a case. In your opinion, where are we in world history, and any other thoughts on that?
I think we're approaching a tipping point, and it's a tipping point of a socialist agenda taking over the vast majority of the world. I come on shows like this. I obviously I run a business, but I like to say I'm a Bitcoin evangelist. And the reason I'm so dedicated to this is that I believe that the most important component of determining whether or not that agenda happens or not is the control of the economic system, the monetary system. And at a minimum, if a parallel system exists, then I think there is a chance of slowing down or stopping or minimizing that change. If the existing financial structure and power structure stays in place, I hate to be dystopian, but it's very, very scary that as a technologist, I see the ability of the technology with things like central bank digital currencies combined with social credit scores, combined with socialist agendas. Very, we live in a republic that protects the rights of minorities in minority groups. I don't just mean ethnic minorities, but it could be, minorities in different viewpoints on different issues. It creates, Judge Scalia once, I heard him talk once, he talked about how the system itself is somewhat geared toward gridlock, meaning change is slow. I think that's a really important thing because in a pure democracy, you end up eventually in a purely socialist, centrally controlled point. It's almost inevitable. We've seen what's happening in Europe. You just do the game theory on it. You go, well, that almost has to be the end point. And as long as they control the money printer, the people with that agenda, as long as they control the money printer, they can do whatever they want. And even worse, if they control the monetary system and can determine whether or not what you want to spend money on and when you want to spend it is appropriate, you have a problem. I'm going to be a little dystopian here, but it worries me, like to say, well, if I went to the doctor and we have a national healthcare record system and my BMI is 31, and on the way home from the doctor, I want to stop at McDonald's and get a chocolate shake. And when I go to try to pay for it, they say, well, no, if you have a BMI over 30, you can't buy chocolate shakes. I'm just giving that as an example, but that's the kind of world I don't want to live in. I'm 58 years old. I don't want my kids, my grandkids, to live in that world. I also want a world where if they go earn money, doing whatever they do, that somebody else isn't going to debase it, and that they have a place where they can store that wealth, hopefully multiple places, but at least one place where they can store that wealth and it won't be debased. and it can't be stolen from them. Those are simple things. But, to get back where your question is, I think we're at a tipping point, and I think people have to fight. The encouraging thing I would say, you mentioned what's happening in the Netherlands right now. Anybody that hasn't watched that, go find some international news sources, find some YouTube video on the battle between the farmers and the government there. It's fascinating. But also go look what's happening in Sri Lanka, central bank failure. What's happening in Lebanon, central bank failure. What's happening in Ecuador? Looks like the beginnings of maybe a central bank failure. You have massive protests, riots, people fighting back against this system where they've been abused. So that gives me hope that there are people with backbones. The Canadian trucker protest, I thought it was wonderful to see the protest, but disturbing to see that a whole bunch of Canadians weren't equally irritated by that. That, you said you're in northern Idaho, so you're probably not that far from the border. Like, that was shocking to me that the majority of Canadians did not see the injustice and the path that they're on when the government, I'm not just talking the vaccine mandates, but then the vaccine mandates, the mask mandates, the quarantines, those sort of things, but then extending that to just the right of these people to protest in what I view as a very peaceful manner. If that's not peaceful, then I don't know what is.
And here in North Idaho, I mean, it must be something like 70% of the people are aware of these issues that you brought up and are vehemently opposed and not interested in these ideas or agendas. I see more people kind of aware to the superstructure of the world, if you will, to how the world actually operates than I've ever seen. I would say that it's probably been about, I guess I figured out what we would come to know as the World Economic Forum colloquially probably about 12 years ago. And I keep thinking, especially lately, the last 6 months, how much different the global conversation feels than at any other point to that time. And on your example of BMI and not being able to buy a chocolate shake, another example that I've heard is that, like, let's say there's another lockdown and you're not allowed to leave your home, go a mile from your home. Your card might not work a mile from your home in that scenario.
Sure.
Now, like I said, I just wanted
your whole wallet might not work. You couldn't go to the grocery store. You couldn't get a cup of coffee. You couldn't buy a newspaper, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
I wanted to note that I agree with you generally. I also see a lot more people informed about this stuff every day than ever before. And now I wanted to, as we close here, hear about your new production. The first episode of your new show came out on June 30th,
Yeah.
Mind Your Business. Can you tell us a little bit about Mind Your Business right before we wrap up?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I as I mentioned, I'm an older guy. Those of you who are watching can tell that. And there's a lot of podcasts out there. There's a lot of shows out there that cover economics, Bitcoin, things like that. I will touch on those, but I want to do it from the perspective of a miner and also as a boomer. And I think that I'm going to try to bring. It won't be exclusively older people, but a lot of more seasoned people who've been around the block, who this isn't the first rodeo. This isn't our first. It's not our first recession. It's not our first time we've been upset with the Fed. And try to bring those optics in. And my first guest is a guy named James Lavish, who's a very, very strong voice in the Bitcoin world. But came at it from the Wall Street angle, and I came at it. You mentioned a little of my background, but I came at the world as a technologist and as a guy who worked in the Fortune 500 and the executive suite of the Fortune 500. And what I like to say is I find it interesting as I go out and I talk with people. I love to find that we often have arrived at the same point. You and I have just met today. We share, I know in the hour we spent with each other, we share a lot of philosophical commonality. And I find it interesting when people arrive at the same point coming from very different avenues, that there's a certain comfort in knowing that we've traveled these very different roads to come to the same place. And I like to share that. So anyway, that's a little about mind your business and what we're trying to dig into there.
It was a delightful conversation. Thank you so much, Bob. Obviously, one of the most important conversations that can be had around not only the topic of Bitcoin, but also cryptocurrency in general, that is mining, the state of mining, and the regulation that's coming after mining, quite frankly. Like I said, I'm here just right east of Washington State, and that was quite stupefying when I saw that they had instituted that 29% tax or tariff on miners. And remember, not too long ago, Washington State was the mining epicenter of the US, I believe.
It was.
Wenatchee.
It was. Yes, that basin was phenomenal. We were highly interested in being there. And I guess time will tell, but it would be my prediction that jurisdictions like that make that choice to essentially chase away this industry will regret it in the long term. That there's a lot of economic benefit, and ultimately probably benefit in access to the monetary system and even the freedom of the people in those areas that will result from places that have embraced it. And so I hope they reverse it, but even if they did, people are still going to be scared for a long time. Companies like me aren't going to say, well, I'm going to go invest additional capital in there. If they banned it once, maybe they'll ban it twice, right? So
people are leaving those states in droves. So we have had the honor and the privilege of sitting down today with Bob Burnett. He is a Bitcoin evangelist. He's also the chairman and CEO at Barefoot Mining, which you can check out at barefootmining.com. He's former CTO and EVP at Gateway Incorporated. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Justin. I enjoyed it.
Pleasure's all mine. And thank you, everyone, for listening.